All right, folks, we are going to get started here. First thing that we're going to talk about tonight is something that runs or gives people a lot of grief when they're building their own families. It's the message from Revit that constraints are not satisfied. Now, we're going to talk about the different kinds of constraints, but what a constraint in Revit is, and within the context of building your own family objects, constraints are when you lock part of your family to something else. Now that might be a previously modeled part of the family, or it might be a reference plane. Now what I would do is for you folks, I would suggest that you get everything from the session 6 folder for tonight and just have it ready to go on your desktop. So I'm just going to pull it down here. All right. Now, in tonight's share out folder, I've got a couple of families that talk about the approach of how you should build a family. Now, if you look at the screenshots on our notes, you can see that we've got a picture of this family, which I'm going to pull up here. So it's the 313 light with mid-vent. 313 light with mid-vent. Okay, and here it is here. Now, if we look at how this family was built, these little things, these little rectangles above and below the window are false concrete headers and sills. So if we look at the outside of this thing, there it is there. So there is these fake concrete lintels and sills that was part of the design. But the window itself otherwise, other than these little bits at the top and bottom, and the way that you should do any kind of an object is from the outside in. So if I were just to draw this up on the board, and this strategy pertains mostly to doors and windows. For other kinds of objects, you know, the outside-in approach is, I suppose, obvious. And with windows and doors, it follows the same approach. Now, you've got the opening that comes with the template. And that opening object is there. Remember last week we talked about deleting the opening object if you're going to use voids to make the hole in the wall. And that's, of course, necessary if the hole through the wall is not going to be just a simple punch right through. So last week we had that displayed window that we were talking about. So you've got your opening. So that opening object is the first layer, or the first set of edges upon which you add the other geometry. So your first layer of building everything is the opening, so let's number it here. So number 1 is the opening. Now if you needed to do something like a round-topped window, or you needed to make kind of an irregular shape, or both, so in this case here, let's just say that I was doing a round-topped window that also had a piece coming down on the side, but didn't come down all the way. So if you needed to make a window that had this funky shape, you would have to modify the opening object to follow that shape. That would be your first order of business. So the opening is what really drives the shape of your door or window. So once you've got the opening in place, then the frame around the outside of the opening is the next piece of the puzzle. So it could be the door frame or the window frame, but that perimeter piece that wraps around will be the next part that's modeled. And in this case, that also includes these little bits of the frame in the middle. And that's all indicated from left to right in the notes. Oh, there's nothing there, it just goes all the way up. Now the reason it's called a 3-1-3 window is just sort of a nomenclature that I use. 3 lights here, 1 light in the middle, 3 in the next column. That's why it's called a 3-1-3 window. So that's number 2, the exterior part of the frame. Then the next thing that's got to go in is the vent frame. So I'll just draw it green here. So of course it's in 2 pieces here. The frame, the exterior part of the vent frame is dependent upon the window frame for its location. We'll look at this in detail. So number 3 is the vent frame. And of course, if you don't have a vent frame in your window, the secondary frame, then it doesn't matter. But I modeled this extra bit of vent frame so it's clear when you're looking at the exterior elevations where the operable part of the window is. Now I could have just put in the dashed symbolic lines here for the vent frame and just called it a day, but I wanted to model that little piece there just to give it that little extra bit of realism when you're viewing this window in elevation from the exterior. So we do the opening, the exterior frame, the vent frame, and of course the last thing that's got to go in is all of the glass. So I'll just draw that in red here. And the glass, even I'm showing a bit of a separation here, the glass goes right to the edge of the frame. And we use the pick tool when we're putting in the glass extrusion so that the glass extrusion sketch lines, those pink sketch lines, are picked and locked to the edges of the window frame. So that happens everywhere here. So, and finally, I'll just draw one more here. So finally, step 4 is the glass. Both the fixed glass here and also the vent glass inside our operable part of the window. So from the outside to the inside. Now you've got multiple extrusions that are being used to draw this. Multiple extrusions, one for the frame, second for the vent frame, and then a third extrusion for the glass, 3 extrusions. Now when you look at the number of reference planes that are used in this example, I've got a very minimal number of reference planes. I've got a reference plane horizontally for each one of the major divisions, vertically on the window, and then reference planes that are placed vertically for the different major horizontal divisions of this window. Now there's another approach here that I'm going to show you that means that you're not quite having to be so disciplined about the order with which you build something like this, a window or a door. That's got different pieces in it, you know, a frame, a leaf, piece of glass and a leaf, trim around the outside of the door. So the reason that I often will be very disciplined about building the windows is this. Now I'm just going to walk you through the process and you'll be able to look at the different extrusions that comprise this window. So first of all, we've got our, I'm just tab selecting for the opening here. There's my opening object. Now I didn't modify it, I just left it as is in this family. But now the next thing that I did is I built this extrusion here. So if you edit it and you look inside it, these outer sketch lines were placed using the pick tool with the lock function turned on at the edge of the opening, all four sides. So that was the first step. Then I offset those sketch lines inbound and then did all the other bits and pieces here. And we're going to talk about these EQ dimensions and the dimensions adjacent to them in a few moments. So this whole exterior window frame is done. Parametric dimensions placed, so I can change the width of the frame whenever I want. And then I move on to putting in the vent frame. So there's the vent frame there. So I select this and I hit edit. And so the four outer sketch lines of this extrusion for my vent frame, same thing. This guy right here, I used the pick tool with lock enabled and picked the outer edge of my window frame so that as my window frame stretches and moves, my vent frame for this window will follow suit. So once that's done, then the glass. And the glass, I put my cursor at the edge of the glass, just at the edge of one of the mullions. There's my glass extrusion. And so all of these glass extrusion lines, again, were placed using the pick tool. So let's just show you what that looked like. So there's the pick tool with lock enabled. Hover over one of those lines of my frame, hit the tab key twice, once, twice, and there's the lines for the glass extrusion in this bay. And then tab, tab, next bay, tab, tab, next bay, and finish. Now there's one more glass extrusion here. I made it separately for some reason, and that's for the one inside the vent frame. So same idea. You can see there's no dimensions on it, doesn't need any. For this glass to keep its proper shape, I just had to use the pick tool. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're done. Now, for setting the glass and the frame and those different pieces in plan, we have these different reference planes. If you folks were in the intro class, we would have walked you through doing a window where we set some of these reference planes here. We're going to do a similar window tonight, so you'll have another chance to give it a go. So we've got a reference plane for the front of the wall, a reference plane, for the front of the window, a reference plane for the back of the window, and a reference plane right here for the glass. So those three reference planes help stack all the different extrusions that comprise this window. Now, what I'm going to do now is contrast the way this family was built with another family that's in tonight's Share Out folder. If you folks find the 313 light with mid-vent reference planes, find that family and open it. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put these two families side by side. Try and get myself some more space here. Hit the wrong button. There we go. Okay, so here are these same families, or same window I should say, same design, same functionality. So on the right is the one that's called ref planes, and on the left is the one that we've been talking about already. Now straight away, there's two things you're going to notice. The one on the right, there's reference planes at the side of each mullion. There's a reference plane at the center of the mullion, and all the dimensions that define how this thing works in terms of making it parametric, they're all visible. So the reference planes are all in place, dimensions as well. So this family over here has fewer dimensions, and the dimensions that make this window parametric are sort of buried, if you will, inside our exterior window extrusion. So if I take the regular window here, not the one with the ref planes, and I edit the sketch, so you can see that inside the sketch, that's where all these parametric dimensions are. Now, with this window here, all of the reference planes at either side of the mullions in the window, and here for the vent glass as well. See, for the width of the vent frame, there's a reference plane here, and here, and here. Quite a lot more reference planes in this family. But the difference being that with this family on the right, you do not have to be terribly disciplined about the order with which you build these extrusions. And the reason is that all of these extrusions are locked to these reference planes. So when I built my window frame extruder, the outer part of my window, let's have a look at that one's extrusion. There it is. There's no dimensions in it at all. So when I did the extrusion in this window, each one of these sketch lines was placed using the pick tool with lock enabled, and I chose the reference plane that it was already created. So the reference plane here that defines where this little bit of the sketch line sits is not inside the extrusion. I drew it before I made the extrusion. So in this sense, this system takes a little bit more planning, because you've got to put down these reference planes first, put the dimensions on them, and then go and build your extrusions. So this is a little bit more work. You've got to draw a lot more reference planes first, but all of the aligns and locks and constraints and all that stuff on this window go back to the reference planes. On this one, after I've done my exterior frame, the glass just locks to the frame, the vent frame locks to the window frame, and the glass and vent locks to the vent frame, and the glass and the rest of the window locks to the frame. So you can decide which approach appeals more. Some people like to use this method here because they don't have to worry about what's been picked first. That all just goes out the window because the glass is locked and aligned to the reference plane. So let's just go and show you how that process would look. So the reference planes already created. So in this system, this is what I would do. I'd draw a little rectangle right on these reference planes. Actually, here, I'll draw it off the reference planes here for a moment. So there's the rectangle. It's not quite on the reference planes. And then I'd use the align command. Reference plane first, then sketch line and lock. Reference plane, sketch line, lock. All four sides for every bay of this window. So the advantage here in your noggin is that you know that it's the reference planes that are driving the bus. That's what runs this whole show. And you just have to lock now your glass to those same sketch lines. So being done here now, when I do my glass, right here, same thing. I don't worry about the locking it to the frame. I'm going to run it right back to the reference planes. So I'll just draw my, actually here I'll show you. You can use the pick tool with lock enabled. Pick a reference plane, pick a reference plane, pick a reference plane, pick a reference plane, and then use the trim command to make it into a rectangle again. So both approaches would work. But in both cases, it's the reference planes that are keeping everything organized in this version of building a family, and that's how the constraints have been set up. So as you folks get into building windows and doors and stuff that have these multiple sort of hierarchies of components or solids, extrusions, what have you, inside the family, you can decide which approach you want to take. Okay, so let's go over to page 2, and we'll start talking about constraining geometry in your families. Now, you've already seen me creating a constraint already, just in these last few minutes. So, for instance, this glass. You can see here that there's all these locks all over the place. These locks are telling you that this pink sketch line is constrained to something here. It doesn't necessarily tell you whether this pink sketch line is locked to this reference plane or locked to the frame extrusion. Don't know. That's kind of where, when you build a family, you know how you did it. Sometimes you'll download a family from off the internet and you change its size in type properties and it blows up. Now you are having to troubleshoot somebody else's family. Not fun. I don't really like getting families off Revit City, for instance. Revit City is terrible for that. There's lots of just crap families that weren't built with any logic. So that's where a little bit of discipline is good, and that's why building your own repository of families over the years is highly recommended. So that is an edge constraint. So you've done it lots of times. So if we look at the different kinds of constraints, there's the 3 bullet points there. Constraining lines in a sketch to other geometry. So in the case of our window built without the reference planes, that's how this one was built. So for instance, our glass, right, the edges of the glass are constrained to other geometry. Geometry in this case being the frame. So when I edit this glass, all these lines are constrained only to the frame. Constraining lines in a sketch to reference planes contained inside the sketch. Now what does that mean? Well, it means when I built this family, if I'd wanted to, I could have put the reference planes to define where the edges of the frame are inside the extrusion, like this. See those reference planes? They're inside the sketch. So when I finish, you don't see them. But when you edit the extrusion again, there they are. So these are reference planes inside the sketch. So what I could do, that's my glass. I don't need to worry about them in here. But I could do that in my frame extrusion. So let's talk about putting reference planes inside the sketch. Now let's just do a little mental probability exercise. Okay, so I built this family. You folks can see I've got a parametric dimension over here that controls the width between these 2 sketch lines. Now, if I take my interior mullion width value and I change it up to 2 inches, obviously, these 2 sketch lines are going to widen apart. What about these ones over here? Anybody? So the reality is, unless you do something, chances are that these 2 sketch lines over here aren't going to do anything if you change its value. Because there's no dimension on it. Unless you use the align command. So what I did was after I put the dimensions here, I used the align command, I picked this sketch line, then I picked the one parallel to it. Did the same here. Pick this one first, it's got the dimension on it. Pick this one second, and now these two sketch lines are locked to these two sketch lines that have the dimensions on them. So when this thing changes its value, these ones move as well. Yes, sir?
Is there any way to know how it is by looking at it, or you have to
You can, well, when you click on it, so when I click on the sketch line here, you can see that there's a dashed line going across, and there's a lock there saying that, you know, like, my God, look at all the locks, right? I can just feel your brain exploding. If you built this family, you're like, hey man, it's all cool, right? But trying to troubleshoot this, if I were to give this family to you, you know, if you were to change its value and for some reason these lines, you know, didn't move but these ones did, and you opened it up, you'd feel like, oh, I just give up. So an alternative to this very disciplined approach, again, so for instance, look at these two sketch lines. These ones have the dimension on them, not these ones, and not these ones. So I had to use the align command twice. Align this guy to this one, and this one to this one. And same on the other side. So, you know, there's a little bit of discipline, a little bit of setup. Probably took me, you know, 5 minutes to get this extrusion ready to go with all the alignment stuff. Now, if you feel like that's going to be too much mental hardship, there's this idea of putting your reference planes inside the sketch. Now the advantage being, once you've got this frame set up, the glass is easy. The vent frame is easy. This is kind of the most complicated part. A lot of times if I'm building a family, I don't want to see a whole lot of those reference planes. They're really busy. And there's, you know, if I can keep these as uncluttered as possible, then great. So the sort of intermediate approach between all this discipline of using the align command and having a bunch of reference planes in your family is to put the reference planes inside this frame sketch. So what that would mean would be these guys here, well, I'll just leave them. But I draw a reference plane, so create, and then reference plane. I would draw one where I want my and so now what I would do is I would dimension these. So I've already got the parameter here, so that's good to go. Where is it here? Interior mullion width. There. So now instead of having my reference planes, or my sketch lines rather, dimension to anything, I'm just going to run all of these sketch lines here, all 4 of them, and align them back to this reference plane. So I'll just use the align command. Pick the reference plane first, then the sketch line, lock it. Pick the reference plane first again, hit the sketch line, and lock it. Whatever. And then both sides here, right? So so it means now is that this parametric dimension drives these reference planes inside the sketch so that when I'm done, it still is fairly clean to look at, not a whole lot of reference planes, but just to help you keep organized, those reference planes are inside the extrusion sketch. So that's an option that you can use in the future. There's lots of different ways to build these objects, but the setting up of these reference planes is important, especially if you're doing windows, because you know we've got a lot of these different dividers that we need to put into our windows, and you know you've got to have those reference planes one way or the other. So they can be constrained to reference planes inside or outside the sketch. So constraining lines in a sketch to reference planes outside the sketch is the example that I'm showing here with this 313 light ref planes family. So there's the other option here. constraining your geometry to reference planes outside the sketch. I find this to be a lot more work, so I don't even bother. So if I'm going to choose one of those 3 bullet points, I always go with the first one. Least amount of reference planes, least amount of work for me, build it from outside to in, nobody gets hurt. And it works just great. Okay, constraining sketch lines. So edge constrained, you've seen that. That is where we use the pick tool. Align constrained, so what that means is that, as I showed you here, this is where you have some geometry that's your line geometry here, like for this glass extrusion, and it's not right on those reference planes, right? So this glass, part of the glass extrusion isn't right on these reference planes yet. So I'm going to use the align command. So this is an alignment constraint. Pick the reference plane, then the sketch line, and lock it. So that is an align constraint. Okay, center constrained. Now you've noticed that with a bunch of these dimensions, I'm going to go back to the regular 301 light family and edit the edit my frame extrusion. Now you've seen these right here, an EQ constraint with another dimension on it. These work together. So here's how it works. Now, when you are building your door or window and you've got this reference plane that runs down the center, so it breaks this window up into 3 parts horizontally. And so when I first put in these sketch lines, I would have used the pick tool with a 1-inch offset so that I could start from the reference plane and put a line on either side. Now what I want to do in the future is that whenever my frame width parameter changes value, I want these 2 sketch lines to stay centered on this reference plane. So the secret sauce to making that happen is an equality constraint dimension. So you grab your dimension tool, pick a sketch line, and then pick the reference plane in the middle. So now you've got a dimension string that has 2 dimensions in 1-dimension object. There it is. And if you zoom out a bit, we should be able to find, oh, there it is, the EQ toggle. And that's what you get. So what happens? As frame width changes its value, this equality constraint forces these 2 sketch lines to stay centered on this reference plane. If you didn't do that, God knows what could happen. The reference plane could move back and forth, and these 2 pink lines might just stay where they are. So this does 2 things. Number 1, it keeps the sketch lines centered on the reference plane, and it forces them to follow that reference plane. So as you fiddle around with whatever dimensions that move this vertical reference plane around, this EQ dimension drags those suckers along. So your sketch lines will follow that reference plane. So that's a major, major little piece of the family puzzle that's used tons of times by experienced Revit users who build a lot of families. And this kind of thing is certainly what sets you folks apart from other Revit users. Haven't paid the freight, haven't joined the cult, right? I mean, every software ends up becoming a bit of a cult because there's this crazy secret knowledge that you need to know to get stuff done in the software. Okay, so that's center constrained. Now you can also have constrained to a point. Let me just give you an example here. And I'm going to use just some symbolic lines on the Annotate tab. So there I've just got some symbolic lines. I've just drawn it in elevation here. Now, when you use a dimension command, you can run a dimension not just from perpendicular to a line or perpendicular to a reference plane. You can also dimension, so say from this reference plane to that point, to that intersection at the end of those two symbolic lines. And they could be model lines or they could be symbolic lines. The point being that I can move this point around right? So here I can change this dimensions value and you can see it moves that point. Kind of an interesting thing. Now, sometimes I'm looking at this and I can't even tell you what the application for that would be. But what I'm trying to get at is that if you ever need to move the vertex or an intersection around, you can do that. So just run your dimension from whatever reference plane you've got on the go, run it to where you get that little dot icon or that little dot symbol at the end of your cursor, or I'll do it again here. So here's the dimension from the reference plane. And if you don't get it straight away, remember hover tab click. So you just hover over the spot where it is and hit the tab key until Revit gives you that dot. And it'll be a fairly visible dot on your screen, a few pixels wide, and that'll allow you to select it. So that's constraining to a point. So maybe we'll just take a break here for 10 minutes if you folks want to grab a coffee, and we'll come back at 22.